Welcome to another episode of Breakthrough Dialogues, the podcast for pragmatists and problem solvers brought to you by the Breakthrough Institute. I am Alex Trembath, your host and deputy director here at Breakthrough. For this episode, I spoke with Julian NoiseCat. Julian is a writer, a researcher, and a journalist, formerly of 350.org and now at Data for Progress. He's also the narrative change director at the Natural History Museum. I was really excited to talk to Julian because I think that he brings a fluency both to the sort of policy weeds around climate and environmental policy, as well as a deep and very well-considered experience in climate and environmental organizing. I think you'll really enjoy this conversation. Julian, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
So I want to talk about Greta Thunberg. We're on the heels of the climate strike in the last few weeks, sort of all over the world. I want to talk about Green New Deal. But I was preparing for this conversation, and I learned that you actually have a position that I wasn't aware of, the narrative change director for the Natural History Museum. So I was curious. Narrative change is actually something that Breakthrough is really interested in conversations around energy and the environment. So I was curious what that meant for the Natural History Museum's mission, what the work is, and what your sort of role in that capacity is. So I wanted to start by asking with that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm a millennial in the gig economy, so that's a way of saying that I have too many titles.
Right.
But so the Natural History Museum is actually neither a museum nor an organization that's particularly interested in natural history as it is currently sort of created. It's actually an artist and activist collective. We do work in museums to leverage museums, which are some of the most trusted cultural institutions, as advocates for climate and environmental justice. And we do that with exhibitions, campaigns, and writing, some academic writing, all that sort of stuff. So narrative change, it's kind of like a fancy NGOism that is kind of like communications and media work, but sort of on steroids, I guess. It's like very oriented towards not just like press hits, but like the way in which the news is written and the way in which people talk about the issues. That's sort of my take on it.
Yeah, our listeners may remember we had George Sparks here earlier this year on this podcast talking about his work at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science and about how museums are actually a really important way to get not just kids, but kids in particular, aware of issues around climate change and environmental problems, especially given that folks are not maybe as up on these issues as you and I are in our day jobs.
Yeah, absolutely. So basically, museums aren't very good at sort of situating the issues and history and science that they're talking about within a social context, and therefore within sort of the power relationships that exist in society and communities and economies and politics, all that sort of stuff. And so we're very interested in bringing those social relationships, those power dynamics to the fore, which inevitably, entails revealing things like the fact that until a couple of years ago, one of the Koch brothers was on the board of the American Museum of Natural History. Rebecca Mercer of the Mercer family, the people behind things like Cambridge Analytica, who have funded climate denial, is also on the board of the American Museum of Natural History. And so that is really what we're trying to uproot and take on and then sort of replace with a more dynamic understanding of natural history that takes into account histories of capitalism, racism, colonialism, and the ways in which those intersect with climate change.
So climate is actually a big focus of yours in that capacity as well.
Yeah, I'm a climate person, I guess now.
Right.
Capital C, capital P, climate person.
Excellent. Well, you and I were talking right before I clicked start recording about that. Now is a pretty interesting time to be a capital C, capital P climate person. Like I said, we're sort of right off the heels as of this recording of the climate strike in New York City and DC and around the world. And you've been involved in climate organizing and climate activism for years. I wanted to ask what you make of this moment. It's not something that I expected to be talking about climate change nearly this much, especially on the heels, in advance of a federal U.S. election. So, what do you make of this moment in climate organizing and activism compared maybe to recent or distant history?
I mean, I'm only 26, but this moment in climate activism makes me feel really old, which is one thing. I feel like an elder because this moment is being driven in part by Greta, of course, who's 16, 10 years younger than I am, and by so many other young people in the Sunrise Movement, the climate strikes, the Extinction Rebellion, and many other organizations, the International Indigenous Youth Council, all of whom are younger than I am. So, I mean, for one, I feel old. It's kind of weird to be in your 20s and feel like an elder hand in the climate movement, but there we are. But on the whole, I think that it's a very exciting. I mean, firstly, it's a very troubling time to be working on climate change because we recently passed 415 parts per million in the atmosphere. I mean, your listeners probably know this, but it's worth recalling that the last time carbon concentration in the atmosphere was that high, there was a forest on Antarctica. The Greenland ice sheet did not exist, and sea levels were 50 feet higher than today. And Homo sapiens, people who we would identify as us, as human, did not yet walk the earth. So this is a dire, dire, dire circumstance that we find ourselves within. But at the same time, there is a really exciting movement that is growing and being led by youth across the United States and around the world. And it's taking on the obstinate forces that have failed to act on this issue. So, on the one hand, our moment is framed by atmospheric physics. And then on the other hand, I think it's framed by the paradox of, an unstoppable force, a social movement colliding with an immovable object, which is, our political institutions, the Electoral College, the gerrymandered House of Representatives, the existence of the filibuster, and of course, the ideology perpetuated by fossil fuel corporations, which has really taken over the Republican Party. And I think the big question, for our time is like what happens in that collision between this rising unstoppable force and that immovable object. And I luckily get to be, I guess, part of the unstoppable force, hopefully, and we'll be like riding along in the first car when we go headlong into the immovable object.
Yeah, it's an interesting time for sure, and I do want to get back to some of the policy and the politics around climate policy, particularly in the United States. But I have a similar reaction to you. And I'm a couple of years older than you are, so I also feel like, if not an elder millennial, then an elder millennial working in the climate space. And it's, it seems to me that we've sort of been here before, at least to some degree. We had quite a bit of salience around climate change post Hurricane Katrina in the mid-aughts. We have had pretty impressive climate demonstrations and organizing, not just in the last 4 weeks or 12 months, but years before this. There were 300,000 people marching in New York City in 2014. So maybe including the youthfulness of this sort of new-ish movement, is this time, do you think, any different? And if so, how?
Well, I mean, one difference is that Kanye hasn't come out and after a hurricane said that the president doesn't care about Black people, which I think would be a pretty useful communications exercise at this moment. So if Kanye West is a listener to the Breakthrough podcast, I think that he should go on national TV and call out the president when a hurricane strikes again. I think that would be useful.
I assume that Kanye is listening. So like Julian said, Kanye.
Yeah, do it, man. So, I mean, difference. I mean, I think that, there's obviously people older than me and older than us who've been doing this for a long time. And I was very young when the cap and trade fight happened. I was just growing up when Hurricane Katrina happened. So I can really only look at this through the lens of like the writers and reporters who I follow. Who've been, covering this stuff for as long as like 30 years. And they say that this is a different moment. In particular, I remember a piece that my friend and colleague Bill McKibben wrote in the New Yorker back in the spring, talking about this sort of climate moment that we're in, wherein I think a number of factors combined about a year ago to sort of jolt the zeitgeist into a new sort of atmosphere, if you will, like a new cultural atmosphere. And I think the combination of factors there were, firstly, you had climate disasters that were being read more often as climate disasters. Paradise, California, turned into hell on earth. A city called Paradise turned into hell, like under 30 minutes. I think that really shocked people and sort of jolted them into greater concern. We obviously had the trilogy of IPCC reports over the last year. The first one on a 1.5 degrees Celsius world, I think, in particular, for some reason, seemed to break through to the media and sort of signal to them that it was finally okay to ring the alarm bell, to freak out in public in the way that they talked about this. And I think if you look at I was looking at the Google Ngram data on this, you see a big spike in climate change right around the publication of that report in October. And I think that really sort of changed the communications and media environment around climate change, which has been a longstanding issue. And then I think lastly, you have activism. You have youth like Greta. You have the Sunrise Movement after the midterms sitting in soon-to-be Speaker Pelosi's office, demanding action on what is going to be perhaps the defining issue of humanity and civilization. And I think that political confrontation, when you have a president who is so closely aligned in the pockets of coal and the fossil fuel industry, when you have more and more young people getting galvanized, taking to the streets, marching. We had 7 million people participate in the climate strikes over the last 2 weeks, or over 2 weeks, sorry, in September. And I think that combination of like social movement and politics, a changing communications environment, and growing awareness and visibility of the impacts of climate change have just created a new sort of moment for this issue. And I think the big question, right, is like whether it is too late or whether we actually have time to stave off some of the worst impacts of this, which is, I mean, we won't really actually know the answer to that question for many years.
Let's talk Green New Deal. A founding view of Breakthrough actually was that climate change is unlike sort of conventional pollution problems, and that it would need to be connected to jobs and infrastructure from both a policy and a politics perspective. At the same time, a lot of us have noticed and maybe even joined a skepticism of the Green New Deal writ large, sort of hitching climate to the Medicare for All, jobs guarantee wagon that arguably, and feel free to push back on this, obviously, make the politics more challenging. So is that the right way to view the Green New Deal in the sort of American political context? Is that the right way to have the debate? If so, how do you work through that? And then if not, then sort of how do you see the Green New Deal engaging or disrupting the climate policy debate?
Quite the question. So, look, everybody, whether they phrase it this way or not, who is looking at doing climate policy is talking about a major transformation in the way we do energy and power, the way we do transportation, the way we do agriculture, the way we do buildings, the way we do industry. I mean, anybody who's actually looking at the issues is talking about a serious societal transformation. We have to decouple economic growth from emissions, which has never really happened in a significant way in human history. The real intervention here, and I think that this gets framed sort of misleadingly when you hear Republicans talking about cow farts and trains to Hawaii, and then you have like sort of third way centrists talking about the fact that we want to nationalize everything, is that like in that transformation to a decarbonized economy, to a clean energy economy, we should be thinking about things like where the jobs are going, who's benefiting from those jobs, where we're building infrastructure, and what that new green economy looks like. How can we live in an era of unprecedented inequality. This is like the new Gilded Age. And you're in Oakland. I mean, just across the bay, San Francisco is the highest per capita city of billionaires in the United States. I think that that's fundamentally, if we do climate policy and we do it right, there is an opportunity to move our country into a more fair and equitable place, which I think is like what people want, and especially what young people want. I mean, we see this in Data for Progress polling. And I think that it's really unfortunate that the other interlocutors in this debate do away with the Republicans, but the sort of center of the Democratic Party that says get all that social policy and take it elsewhere is actually not engaging in good faith, because those questions of who benefits from the jobs, where the infrastructure goes, what the economy looks like after that transformation are inevitably going to have to be dealt with. That is like public policy 101. They just want to pretend that it's not there in front of them.
Yeah, I'll be honest. Something I've always been pessimistic about is the ability to connect sort of energetic social movement and social organizing to things like technology and infrastructure. It's something that Breakthrough and our allies have thought a lot about in the 10 or 15 years that we've been in existence. For us, and not everyone has to view it through this lens, climate change is sort of most fundamentally a technological challenge. We're talking about turning over a planet's worth of technology and infrastructure in a matter of decades to do exactly what you say, decouple economic growth from carbon emissions and other environmental challenges. And it just seems very unlike, in my view, problems that have been sort of effectively organized around in the past. Things like the civil rights movement, things like LGBTQ rights, things like anti-war demonstrations, even things like conventional pollution problems. So is that skepticism or pessimism right? And if so, how does the Green New Deal or sort of this new wave of climate organizing and climate imaginaries sort through that?
So just to clarify the question, you're asking if social movements should have a role in like social movements a la like sort of the civil rights movement, et cetera, should have a role in sort of the climate conversation. Is that the question?
Yeah, I'm eager for them to have a role, and the Green New Deal is compelling to me largely because it is sort of one of the first times that we're talking about climate change as a techno-economic transition or a techno-economic mission, along with a very big and energetic social movement in a way that I didn't really foresee. So what, do you think that's going to be successful? Are the sort of organizing legs of the Green New Deal sort of up to the challenge of that climate demands, which is a largely technological transformation, largely infrastructural transformation? Is this something that the sort of climate movement can really accelerate?
So I think there's a few points that are worth bringing up here. Firstly, I think one of the prominent arguments that emerged after the failure of cap and trade. So just to reiterate the history, cap and trade passed through the House, Waxman-Markey often called, passed through the House, didn't make it to the Senate floor for a vote because Democrats at that time were prioritizing healthcare and financial reform ahead of climate legislation. One of the prominent sort of theses about what went wrong with cap and trade, and in many ways, at least in terms of the political history, the Green New Deal is emerging sort of on top of the grave of cap and trade. And also, I'd say within the intellectual history, sort of similarly, was that there was not enough civil society engagement in the cap and trade fight. I think this is the argument that I can't really pronounce her name, but Feta Skocpol, I think.
I think you got that. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. A sociologist sort of put forward about why Waxman-Markey failed. So I think that we have a very recent example of why social movements are really essential elements to passing public policy and also defending it, right? I think this is another part that we need to remember. Of course, very recently, we saw the Republicans try to repeal Obamacare, and people blitzed Capitol Hill, and they lost. They lost that fight. The Republicans lost that fight. And the reason I bring that up is that we don't only need to pass policies that sort of start us on the path to steep emissions reductions. Of course, at this point, those emissions reductions have to be pretty damn steep because we've waited for so long. We also need to make sure that those policies are durable, right? And what we've seen, unfortunately, with the implementation of climate policy in France, Australia, and we're going to see how it turns out. I'm in Canada right now. We're going to see how it turns out here in October, is that voters, when you implement a carbon price that makes some of their bills go up and also sort of doesn't feel like you're investing at them, like you're actually at odds with the economic interests of middle class and working families, they revolt. That's in part the story of the yellow vests in France. That's what happened in Australia. And again, we'll see what happens in Canada this month. So I think that part of the reason why you really need the social policy, why you really need the social movements, why you need people sort of bought in, public engagement on something like the Green New Deal is not only to create a coalition that can win, a coalition that includes labor unions, environmental justice communities, green groups, progressives, all sort of elements of civil society, faith groups, etc. But also so that people get bought in to climate policy, that they see some social benefit accruing to themselves from climate legislation if and when we pass it, in order to make sure that if Republicans get in, it's not so simple as simply repealing something, that they are going to face the same sort of backlash that they did when they tried to take away people's health care.
It may legitimately be sort of too late to even ponder this, but sort of one group that I don't hear you talking about as much in that civil society coalition is sort of conservatives and Republicans. In this conversation, you've talked about Republicans as an obstacle, and I think that is a fair assessment. But it makes me wonder, if we're talking about durable, enduring climate policy, how we could imagine a bipartisan consensus on the question. And again, I acknowledge that that's sort of a heavy lift. But you look at things like infrastructure, like funding for science and R&D, maybe funding for the military, that are at least more bipartisan than other issues like healthcare, which at least the Republican Party at one point had its own ideas about. If not sort of agreement with the Democrats, then it's sort of its own civil society coalition behind. So I want to ask, from your perspective, working on this for years, your perspective at Data for Progress, is in this day and age, or maybe post-Trump, at least, is a conservative or Republican climate politics and policy possible?
Look, I'm not a Republican, although I do have to sort of keep my eyes on them because they are the opposition in a lot of ways. But so there was a time, I will say, when one could imagine Republicans coming to the table and agreeing on some sort of bipartisan compromise on climate legislation. Of course, the first Bush said he was going to fight the greenhouse effect with the White House effect. John McCain ran, supporting sort of very marginal climate policy, and then got primaried actually by a challenger who was backed by the Koch network, and then changed his tune. And then, of course, a year ago, actually, Carlos Curbelo, I think maybe a little over a year ago now, was going to introduce a very sort of moderate sort of carbon tax and investment program. And his colleagues passed a resolution to preempt the introduction of that bill, in fact, saying that they were repudiating a carbon tax, that they would never support it, that it was bad for the American economy. And of course, now Representative Curbelo is no longer Representative Curbelo. He's not in the House of Representatives anymore. So I think that one of the more fascinating sort of stories of the conservative end of climate politics is the way in which the denial of climate change, whipped up by people like the Kochs, really captured the ideology and then the identity of the Republican Party in a way that actually has overshot now where the industry is saying they are on the issue, right? So people will point out that like ExxonMobil is in favor of a $40 per ton price on carbon, which is not the Republican Party position, right? So conservatives are actually even out ahead of the folks who are funding them. So that is a fascinating dynamic in American politics. I'd love to read somebody who had like a more thoughtful take on this than I do, but I can just lay out the dynamics there. And I will also say that like we're not passing climate legislation right now. We're passing it hopefully after the 2020 elections, and nobody can tell you what the outcome of that election is going to be. We don't know what the makeup of the Senate is going to be. And we therefore don't know sort of exactly the scenario in which we will be trying to get a climate bill through, the Senate, which has been a barrier for basically every major bill ever. So I think that question of like, should we compromise with Republicans is a little bit preemptive, because right now what we're trying to do is we're trying to come up with and articulate the full-throated democratic approach to climate policy, which the Democrats, that is the party that I vote for. But for many years, they treated climate change like an applause line. There wasn't much interest for the last few years in coming up with what the Democratic consensus was on climate change. And I think that's a lot of what sort of brought us to this moment. So, I think that the theory behind the Green New Deal is that Republicans can't be trusted to sort of work with Democrats. I think you see this on a number of issue areas way beyond climate change, of course, with the way that McConnell behaves around Supreme Court appointments, the way that he's blatantly lying about impeachment stuff. These are not the kind of folks who you want to be cutting deals with this early on. And so I think that the strategy, the political legislative strategy built around the Green New Deal is one of going all in on a Democratic view for climate policy. And then maybe, let's see how things go in 2020. I'm feeling a little bit hopeful. Maybe we get into a place where we figure out what can be done through budget reconciliation, executive action, et cetera. Or maybe we come to a place where, there might be things, to your point, around the edges, infrastructure, research and development, et cetera, that some Republicans can agree on. But that is not where we're at right now. And I think it's really important not to compromise before there's anything to compromise on. I think that Democrats are really bad about this. We are super scared of our own values and of our own sort of policy views. And I think that we need to change that posture because as it turns out, the polling that we've done with Data for Progress is that people love things like clean energy investments. People love things like the Green New Deal. They want job creation. They want justice. And I think that we need to be less scared of articulating where exactly we actually stand on these issues.
You mentioned that climate change has historically been an applause line for politicians at best, particularly politicians on the left side of the aisle, which is something I very strongly agree with. And it seems like Data for Progress, your organization, is one of the few and relatively new organizations on the scene that is working to change that. And to my eye, it really does seem like Data for Progress is punching above its weight, given sort of how new and how small you are. So I want to ask someone, you who is relatively new to the organization, sort of what drew you to Data for Progress, and what are you imagining the sort of scope and ambition of your work being in the next year or 2 or 4 or 10?
Well, I'd be lying if I said that the thing that first introduced me to Sean McElwee was his weekly happy hour in New York, which I think almost every lefty scenester has been to. Location cannot be disclosed. in case the Proud Boys want to come bust it up. But yeah, so I think that was the immediate thing. I mean, look, I think part of the other issue that we face right now, to that point about like Democrats being afraid of their own shadow, is that unfortunately we have inherited as millennials, I think, a set of institutions, whether it be big green groups, progressive think tanks like the Center for American Progress, a number of other institutions that were built for a prior political consensus that is sometimes the term of art is neoliberalism, that don't represent our values and also create these bureaucracies that I think there's tons of incredibly smart. I seem to meet really, really bright, driven, talented millennials every single day who want to go do the work, who don't particularly care about how much they get paid and just want to go, fight the good fight. And unfortunately, like the institutions that existed before weren't set up to allow them to do that. So I think it's very notable that not just Data for Progress is a new sort of startup, lefty organization, but you also have Sunrise, which is, they got seed funding from Sierra Club and 350, but they're their own entity. And I think they couldn't be doing the work that they're doing if they weren't their own entity. You similarly have things like Justice Democrats, a PAC that is that elected AOC. You also have our colleagues at New Consensus. I think you have all of these new upstart organizations that are creating a space, I think, for millennials and particularly progressives to assert our political voice, which basically all the polling says that like millennials lean socialist. One of the other organizations that has benefited from this sort of new young political energy is the Democratic Socialists of America, which is not exactly a new organization. It was founded a bunch of decades ago, but now boasts way more members than it did 5 years ago. So I think that those dynamics of institutions being built for a prior consensus, one that was a little bit more conciliatory, definitely wouldn't do something like sit in on the speaker's office right after she retook the House, combined with, I think, a young energy that is what we believe, because we lived through the financial crisis and now we are coming of age in the climate crisis, is what this new sort of social, political, environmental circumstance demands.
Given that you are a millennial with many titles, I wanted to close by asking about another part of your life, which is your role as a writer and a journalist in environmental, but also in other issues. I just wanted to ask you for your view and your perspective on environmental storytelling and environmental reporting. What has been your sort of takeaway telling these stories, telling climate stories from a new perspective, doing climate reporting?
If I lived in another economy and moment, and definitely in another media industry, I think I would just be a journalist, because I'm the kind of reporter who, like, when I get out in the field, on the ground, talk to people, get to hear their stories, I don't even eat. Like I am so hyper focused on the interviews that I'm getting and the notes I'm taking and the pursuit of that story that I forget about other essential bodily functions, more or less. So I think that firstly, say what you will about sort of the decline of journalism and in some ways the failure of media to really step up to the climate crisis. I think that done well, journalism reporting is so essential to a functioning democracy, and is something that I personally love to do and enjoy, and will do it for a tiny amount of money because it's like a passion of mine. But one sort of takeaway that I have in my I'm obviously like an early career journalist, but one takeaway I have from doing the coverage that I get to do, which is to go out usually into indigenous communities and interview them and talk to them about the issues that they're facing, is that environmental stories, I think, are much stronger when we're not just talking about, what I led the podcast with, which is like the parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere, or even the share of renewables on the grid. But when we're talking about like the human side of these things. Like, who are the people who are, directly impacted by climate change? What does that look like for them in their day-to-day lives? Who are the people who live with the threat of the expansion of the fossil fuel industry plowing through the graveyards of their ancestors in their own homes? Just last week, actually, I was in northern Quebec, where a Cree family is facing the potential complete annihilation of a mountain that is in their family's hunting grounds, their trap line, by mining. They're gonna come in potentially, and if they get enough investors, level a mountain that was, for basically as long as anybody can remember, the place where this family went and hunted moose and provided for their family. And I went up to the top of that mountain. And I stood there with some of them, and I asked them what it felt like to be on the top of this mountain that had provided so much for their family, and was now maybe going to be annihilated by development, by mining. And one of the daughters, I saw her, take her glasses off and wipe a tear from her eye. And I think it's those kinds of stories of seeing what this really means, not in the abstract or in the numbers and all that sort of stuff, but what it means for people like that, is really what makes I think doing journalism, and then also I hope reading and listening to podcasts and all that sort of stuff potentially very powerful. So yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important part of this fight too, is the story. And we obviously don't know how that story ends yet, but let's hope it's not as bad as some of the projections say.
Well, with that story in mind, I want to thank you for your work and for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for tuning into Breakthrough Dialogues. If you like our show, tell your friends, rate us, and subscribe on whatever platform you get your podcast. I want to again thank my guest, Julian NoiseCat, and our producers, Alyssa Kadaman and Tolly Perlman. Catch you next time.